Okay, it's about time. Please make sure you can hear me and see me clearly, okay? Let's get started. Welcome back to a special series on World Englishes. In this series, we have been thinking about English not as a single language, but as a language with many different varieties around the world. The other day, we looked at differences between British and American English in terms of pronunciation. Today, we're going to look at differences in vocabulary, grammar, and spelling, and so on. And then think about which variety of English we should learn. Okay, so let's start by thinking about vocabulary. One of the most noticeable differences between British and American English is that people sometimes use completely different words for the same thing. So let's start with these shoes. What would you call them? Would you say sneakers or trainers? Okay, Americans usually say sneakers, while British people normally say trainers. Of course, both words refer to exactly the same type of shoes. Let's look at another example. What would you call this type of housing? Americans usually say apartment, whereas British people generally say flat. And here's one more example. What would you call this? Americans usually stand in a line, while British people stand in a queue. There are more examples like these. The objects themselves are exactly the same, only the words are different. Interestingly, sometimes British and American English use the same word, but they imagine different things. Let's start with the word chips. What comes to mind when you hear this word? In America, chips usually refer to thin slice of fried potatoes that British people called crisps. In Britain, however, chips are what Americans call French fries. So even though the word is exactly the same, British and American speakers imagine completely different things. Look at another example. For Americans, football refers to American football. For British people, football almost always means the sports that Americans call soccer. Here's another example. In American English, the floor at street level is called the first floor. In Japan, it's the same, ikkai. In British English, however, the floor at street level has a different name. It's called the ground floor. The floor above it is called the first floor. So as a result, British people and American people, when they want to find themselves or find each other, they ended up on a different floors of the same building. Here are some examples. Sometimes people use the same word but imagine completely different things. And this can sometimes lead to misunderstandings. Now let's move on to spelling. So unlike pronunciation, spelling differences are easy because you can see them. In many cases, British and American spelling follows regular patterns. Let's start with a familiar example. Americans write color without a U, but British people add U and write COLOUR. Another common pattern involves the endings ER and RE. Americans write center with ER at the end, theater or theater, meter, ending in ER. British people usually reverse the last two letters and write center, theater, and meter, RE. Next, let's look at words ending in SE and CE. Americans have a driver's license ending in SE, and British people have driving license ending in CE. And there are many examples like these. Another common difference involves double letters. Americans usually write traveling, labeled, and cancelled with one L. British people usually write traveling labeled and cancelled with two L's. There are also individual words that are spelled differently. For example, Americans write check, C-H-E-C-K, while British people write check, C-H-E-Q-U-E. Of course, spelling differences do not affect meaning. Americans and British people understand each other perfectly well. These are simply different conventions, I would say. So compared with pronunciation and vocabulary, grammatical differences between British and American English are relatively small. However, there are a few patterns that are worth knowing. Let's begin with the verb have. Americans often say, I have a car. British people, on the other hand, often say, I've got a car. I've got a car. Both expressions mean exactly the same thing. The same difference can be seen in questions. Americans often ask, do you have a pen? While British people often say, have you got a pen? Again, both are perfectly natural. And we can see the same pattern in negative sentences as well. Americans often say, I don't have any money. British people often say, I haven't got any money. Once again, the meaning is exactly the same. Another interesting difference involves collective nouns. Words such as family, company, and government refer to groups of people. Americans usually treat these words as singular, one thing. For example, my family is coming to visit. The company makes company parts. Our British people say sometimes they think of these groups as collective, a collection of individuals. So as a result, they may use either a singular or plural verb. For example, my family is coming to visit, or my family are coming to visit. So same way, British people might say the company makes computer parts or company make computer parts. Same thing is true for government. American may say the government has announced a new policy, while British people say the government has or have announced a new policy. Again, these differences are small. In most situations, people from the two countries communicate without any difficulty. Now let's move on to some everyday expressions. People in Britain and the United States often achieve the same communication goals, but they sometimes use different expressions. So let's start with apologies. Oh no, let's start with, okay. So suppose someone accidentally steps on your foot. Ouch. Americans often say, excuse me. British people also say, excuse me, but they're perhaps more likely to say, sorry. So next, imagine that someone does you a small favor. Americans often say thanks. British people also say the same way, but you may also hear them say cheers. In Britain, cheers does not always refer to drinking, kanpai. It can also mean thank you, or even you're welcome, or goodbye, depending on the situation. Look at one more example. When friends meet, Americans often say, how's it going? In Britain, however, you may hear people say, you're right. You're right. This can sometimes surprise visitors because it sounds like the speaker thinks something is wrong. Well, in fact, it is actually just a casual greeting, similar to saying like hello or how are you. They're simply greeting you in a friendly and informal way. There are many more examples like these. So differences between British and American English are not limited to pronunciation, vocabulary, spelling, and grammar. People may also choose different expressions to achieve the same communication goal. They're simply different ways of using the same language. Now, let's bring everything together and review what we have learned. So first, pronunciation. Overall, I would say, or we can say that Japanese pronunciation tends to be mostly American. But not completely. And vocabulary, Japanese learners are generally more familiar with American vocabulary. Spelling, here the answer is very clear. Japanese students almost always learn American spelling. I don't think I've ever seen British spelling in Japanese textbooks. Japanese schools almost exclusively teach American spelling. Finally, grammar. Again, Japanese learners tend to follow American grammar. Right, now let's move on to what is probably the most important question of this lecture series. Which English should you learn? Unfortunately, there is no simple answer. It depends on several factors such as your goals, your interests, and your reasons for learning English. For some people, one variety of English may be more useful than another. So let's think about a few possibilities. First of all, if you have a clear goal, it often makes sense to learn the English of that particular place. For example, if you plan to study, work, or live in Australia, becoming familiar with the way people speak English in Australia would certainly be helpful. The same is true for Canada, the United Kingdom, or any other English-speaking country. Learning the local variety can help you understand local people more easily, and it can also make it easier for local people to understand you. However, many people do not have a specific destination in mind. In that case, what should you do? Well, my personal recommendation is to use General American pronunciation as your main model. This is not because American English is better than other varieties. Rather, it's because General American pronunciation is widely understood around the world. This is the type of English you often hear in, for example, Hollywood films and major American news channels such as CNN. For many learners, it is probably the safest and most practical choice. However, there is one very important point that I would like to emphasize. You only need one main model for speaking. So, because trying to imitate many different accents at the same time can be very confusing and it's super difficult, I would say. However, when listening, the opposite is true. You should expose yourself to as many different varieties of English as possible. In other words, have one model for speaking, but listen to many different accents. So after 3 lectures on world Englishes, what is the most important message? I think it is this. The goal is not to sound like a native speaker. Well, it's not only difficult, but it's not very practical. I would say the goal is to be understood. English today is a global language, so what matters most is not where your English comes from, but whether it allows you to communicate successfully with other people. Okay, let me finish with one, again, final message. Have one model for speaking, but listen to many different varieties of English. If you can do that, you'll be able to communicate with people from many different countries and backgrounds. And I think that is one of the most important goals for learning English today. Right, before you finish, please complete the Google form. The link is provided in the email that I will send you shortly. Again, I don't think it will take more than 5 minutes. Please make sure to submit your answer by the end of tomorrow. All right? Okay, thank you very much for joining this special lecture series on World Englishes. I hope you enjoyed it, and I hope you will continue exploring the many varieties of English used around the world. Thank you very much, and see you again soon. Bye.